yeah, we're talking about CSS and JS. Does anybody know where it is? At all? No? Has anybody used it at all? A little bit? Okay. So I'll go over, well, what it is first, the problems that we need to solve with it, what the downsides are, because there are downsides regardless of if you've ever heard anything about CSS in JS about being the best thing ever. There are certain things you need to think about, and then go through any questions that you guys have at the end. Feel free to interrupt anytime, I'll try and answer them as we go. So, what is it really? So, it's really just a set of techniques to style your application with JavaScript, which might sound a bit out there at the minute, but if you listen to the rest of it, hopefully I can convince you otherwise. Really though, it's just, there's no standard for this yet, so it's just a bunch of techniques, and generally you'd use a library for this really. I'll go through a bunch of different libraries, and hopefully going through those will give you an idea of what it is about really. So the main ones that I've seen, I've used a few of these, but these are the main ones. So there's something called JSS, and it's got a bunch of adapters, and those are just different ways of writing, different ways of using the JSS library that might look familiar. So there's ways of doing it through objects, ways of doing it through strings. The examples that I'll give should hopefully help out. Style components is another big one that's used in React, if anyone's used React before. Yeah. And emotion is another React one, and I think Aphrodite is React. Emotion is, I think you can use emotion without React, pretty sure you can. So I'm going to go through a few examples before I go into what's next. Yeah, the problems really. Where am I? Okay, so this is just JSS, this is just raw JSS, there's no adapters on top of this, so it's just their interface of how you would implement styling in your JavaScript application without any CSS itself. So the idea is that you define your class and then a bunch of properties inside just through an object. So you'll notice things like text align. It looks familiar to CSS, apart from it's camel cased rather than kebab cased. Things like this as well, where font is an object. So font can be, so when you got like font size, font weight, you can split it out into an object like this. And then your properties, so like link hovers and stuff, they're done with this ampersand that'll refer to the link, and they really just get put on as classes, and you just reference them. So this is just a string template with just a couple of HTML elements in there, and if you want to change something, then I don't know, what have I changed? Has it gone green? Yeah, it's a bit awful. Let's see if we can make something else awful. So that's all just done with JavaScript. There is CSS there obviously, because you need CSS to style a web page, but the styling is generated dynamically with the JavaScript. I've not had to write in CSS itself. I have to know CSS to write it like this, but yeah, there's no CSS that I've written. If you prefer something more with like React, then there is an adapter for that. So this comes from React JSS, created in it. But this will look a bit more familiar if you use the React. So you've got some JSX here. You've got these classes again, which looks the same as the other one, but you're using a hook instead. You pass your theme in, which gets passed in through this theming if you're into that. I've not really seen a use case for it yet, but you can. And yeah, the structure is still the same, apart from now you can use these functions. So this is a theme been passed into this function, and it'll grab you the colour from the theme, the background colour. So I can change that at the top. And it goes right. Those kind of things. So that's one interface using objects and nesting of properties on those things. Then we move to a different variation of this. I think personally I like this one more because it's more realistic. It's more like writing CSS than all of these things. So style components itself is based around this odd syntax. It's called string template literals. I think that's the idea, where you're using these string templates, but you're using them as part of a function call to this thing. There's a bunch of stuff on the documentation, and that's a completely different talk. But other than the weird syntax, all this is going to do is it's going to create you a React component, which is a section along with the styling that is supplied inside of the string template. But in this case, this is a much closer to what you would write with regular CSS, because it is just CSS. You can do other things as well. It does have notation for sound. I can't think of something off the top of my head, but there's stuff you can do for nesting. It does have some nesting, not unlike regular CSS, which doesn't, but in this case it does. And because it's just created you a React component, you can just use them as React components like this and this. So you can just change them, and yeah. There are other things you can do this with this, so you can apply a property to this. So a wrapper, and then if I remember this correctly off the top of my head, yeah, so in this way you can drive your styling through your component props. So I can change this to green, red, whatever. It means I can just have something different in one use case and something a little bit different in another case. So there's some big libraries out there. There's one called Material UI, which drives a lot of its styling through props and other things, so you're not writing your own custom CSS. Because obviously they want to keep you in the material design world, so they don't want you to be able to write your own styling. They want to keep you within their interface, so they provide everything through props. That's specifically Material UI, not material design. Material UI is just the implementation of material design in React. And then another library is Aphrodite. It's got a similar interface to what React JSS did and what JSS had. It's just missing the ampersand here. Again, it's all camel-cased objects and such, and you can do your media queries and stuff in here as keys. And it's going to use the CSS function instead. It's just a different interface. Each library does its own little thing. They mostly do the same thing in the end anyway. Yeah, and I think this one's just React. And then the final one is Emotion. By the way, I didn't make any of these code examples. These are all either made by the people who made the library, so this is made by the person who made the library, or just one that I found on Code Sandbox, which is, well, good enough to talk about. Emotion is probably the most diverse library. It's the library you pick if you're really not sure what you want your interface to look like. It does all of them. So here, this looks exactly like style components. and I think it is style components under the hood, or it's part of it at least. There's an example of a keyframe animation here. So keyframes in CSS are written a little bit differently to just regular CSS blocks like this. So they've got a special keyframes function which handles all of that stuff for you. And then all of these libraries do have global styling, so you can style background of the HTML and body and stuff. But it's also got this object that you can pass CSS in camel case, so it does style component styling as well as just regular JSS type of stuff. You can do them inline if you fancy. All of these things. I think that's what the idea behind this particular code sandbox was, just to show all of them. I probably wouldn't do all of these different crazy things inside the same component, because that would be really hard to read and nuts. But yeah, that's a couple of examples of how you would do these things. Is there any questions on any of these?
If you've got something really wacky like, I don't know, like Shadow DOM or some weird pseudo selectives, are they all supported in style components? Or?
They should be supported in all of these things. Anything you can do in CSS should be supported. I think things like adding ampersand something is just an extension on top of regular CSS. So they all should support regular CSS, otherwise what's the point in them really? Yeah, I've never had to do anything ridiculous or crazy like that yet, but I should do.
Cool.
Do you think style components sort of limit what users can actually do with
How do you mean?
them? So style components, everything's through props, but that's driven by the people that create the components.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you want to apply your own styling, you can still do that with style components?
You can, yeah. So the style function itself has, I'm not going to try and do this off the top of my head, just have to trust me, there is a function for this. So you can do, actually I'm going to try it. So if I want to override title, I call it with title, and then I can, let's say color red. Actually, I'm already red, so we'll go blue. But I've just styled title. I've overridden the color styling, or it's a new, and then there you go. I've overridden that, but I've retained the previous styling from font size and text align. So you can do that. As long as you know it's a style component, you can apply that style component through the style function and apply your CSS on top. So you do have overriding if you really need it.
Cool.
Okay, so why would you want to do this? Why did you just not write why did you just write CSS? Because it is CSS at the end of the day. So there's a couple of reasons. When I've come into this problem a few times, and if you've got a really big application, we're talking about things like BBC website, Sky website, anything that has many teams working across them, all sorts of parts of the business, and they're all working on the one platform. And you've got a style sheet that sits at the top, which provides the styles for the base styling. So in the BBC, really, there's news and there's sport. I mean, there's lots of other parts of it, but they all kind of adhere to the same sizes and stuff. The only thing that's really different is you've got red for news and you've got yellow for sport. Sometimes if a team implements something and they override a particular style, it clobbers styling from somewhere else and you end up with weirdnesses. Like an example is, let's say someone overrides the styling on the global section tag, and that whacks a big margin on it, and a component over here didn't know about that, and it ends up massive. And yeah, because now your CSS between teams have to work, and now that problem happens, you go to that team and you say, can you stop overriding an article? That'd be really nice. And it can get really difficult to manage this unless you've got a bunch of people who are always on it and they're always talking what's going on between the different teams, which is usually not how it happens. It can be quite hard. Whereas with scoping, which is the next point, you can really tie your components to just an interface on like a component level rather than relying on a style sheet somewhere that you've just got a bunch of class names from. It's also possible to, say if you're interested in like really fast page rendering times, you usually want to identify your critical CSS and put that in a style tag at the top and inline it in the body, so you're not actually, well, in the head, so you're not making a request for a CSS file, and you get, as soon as the parser sees it, it starts parsing it rather than loading a file and blocking the render until that file's loaded and parsed. So you can do this through, if anyone's used server-side rendering in any applications before, which has got its own costs behind that, but you can figure out what your critical CSS is that you would want to put into that tag before you start loading components and stuff, and that'll all be there for you ready. There's also tree shaking, if people have used Webpack and tree shaking before. It's basically just dead code analysis, and it is basically, imagine shaking a tree and shaking all of the loose leaves off, where those loose leaves are code that is unused. This is really hard to do with CSS, because usually you end up with styles.css, you load that on your homepage, it's 200 kilobytes, and you use 5% of it, because you've just loaded everyone else's CSS in as well. You've just now parsed 100 kilobytes or 150 kilobytes of extra CSS that you didn't need to do. One, you've loaded it, and two, you've parsed it. And you're going to have to parse that on every page, unless you've got a single page out. But if you go in between different pages, yeah, you're going to have to load a lot of data, and it's just stuff that's not really needed. And one of the things that's quite hard to do is this dynamic styling. Because it's written in JavaScript, you can do what you want with it. You can do anything JavaScript can do with CSS. You can do anything with CSS by using JS to like enhance it. So you can, like I showed before, you can use props to drive things. You can do a different kind of animation if you need to. You can do dynamic theming. Theming is a big one if you need like global theming. You don't need to load a secondary style sheet. So let's say you've got an accessibility feature where you allow the user to increase the text size for some reason. That kind of stuff, you can have a toggle and it'll apply it to the entire page all at once through a theme provider. So you can really basically do anything you can think of with JavaScript. There's also the no need for this for loaders. So if you've ever written a Webpack config before, has everybody used Webpack? Or seen it at least, knows what it does? So it bundles your web apps. One of the problems is you need to know how to bundle all the CSS. You need to know what flavor it's written in. It might be Sass, it might be less, it could be this, it could be that, it could be post CSS. You need to know which plugins you've used. They could, I don't know, it's endless. But with something like this, it's just JavaScript, and the JavaScript's going to inject the styling for you. So you don't need to know how that CSS needs building. It should just work. What was I going to say now? There was something on this. Yeah, so if you've ever done an import statement in JavaScript, and then at the top of your file you'll import React or you'll import whatever, and then you'll import your other libraries, and then At some point you'll import styles.css or styles.sass or something like that. It's actually not valid in the real world. It's not a standard yet. There is there is discussion around standardization of importing other things than JS. But right now, importing CSS is not valid. You're relying on your build tools to recognize what that means. And if you've not implemented the loader for it, you're going to get errors at build time. This translates badly when you publish a library that has CSS built into it. And now you have this explicit knowledge of how your library bundles its styling, and how you'll have to pull it in and build it yourself. And if you've got a bunch of libraries, one could be using Sass, one could be using less, and now you've got to get the Sass plugin and the Sass loader, and then the less plugin and the less loader, and before you know it, your package JSON is 10,000 lines long and you don't know what's going on. So that all sounds really good, right? All sounds good, hopefully. But it does come with a couple of downsides. So the big discussion about the downsides of this stuff is there is a performance hit in quite a lot of cases. So there is runtime performance because it is JavaScript. It is code that has to run, which has a trade-off already. It's not as fast as just parsing CSS that came from a file or just came out of the DOM directly. A lot of libraries are putting a lot of effort into performance. Style Components has gone through a lot of iterations now, and I mean, every major version they managed to get a little bit of extra time in there. There is a complexity with this. In some cases you need to, it's an extra learning curve, especially if you're using something like JSS, which it looks like CSS, but it's objects. You need to then know how to translate those objects into, know how those objects would translate to CSS. So there is cognitive overhead there. The obvious base requirement is that you're in a JavaScript environment. These kind of things won't work for users who have JavaScript disabled. It's not many, but there are people who do disable JavaScript still. The ecosystem is super diverse, as you've seen in the Emotion version, which tries to implement everything. There's a lot of ways to do this stuff. There's tons of ways, and there's no standard for this. I think someone was working on a standard, but there's a lot of libraries right now, and you've got to try and pick the best one for your use case, Style Components. But yeah, there's loads. And one of the other ones is that I think all of these libraries mangle your class names to provide scoping. So Style Components will do this by hashing the style and giving that as the class name. I think JSS appends numbers to the end of what you called it. Either way, any of these libraries, you're not going to be able to know what the class itself is. You'll need to find out the component it came from. You can obviously see the styling it applies in the browser tools, but it can be harder to debug than just regular CSS. I think there's a couple of other ones, but I can't remember what the other trade-offs. They're minor compared to these ones, really. So I think that's hopefully less than 20 minutes. Yeah, any questions? I've realised I'm just like giving a ton of information. There is a lot to talk about with this subject, and it's quite controversial.
I was going to say those trade-offs seem pretty significant to maybe
Some are.
want to avoid.
Some are. It depends.
Stick with
It depends which one are you on? Performance or
the performance and the complexity actually.
performance. Realistically, it's negligible in the real world. And you do get benefits in some cases. You can increase performance by reducing performance somewhere else. So if you inline your critical CSS, you gain performance by not having to parse the other X amount of CSS. Complexity, yeah, but you've got complexity in a massive CSS file as well, and managing a CSS library, there is that too. Again, like if you're bundling, you've got complexity there, webpack loaders, etc. Are you using rollup, are you using parcel, then you have to know how they work, all of that stuff. So there's trade-offs. Sorry, do you?
Yeah, mine was so the hook use style, which we referred to back one of those examples.
In React CSS.
You've got a provider for that around the component.
Yeah.
Do you know if that works in a similar way to the use reducer hook? Does that then percolate and you can access it from any child, or is it?
Yeah, it'll just be. So
the context is all.
Yeah,
all
context. Yeah. So anything, any child underneath the root.
You can actually use that.
You can just use theme, use style. I think use style is different. It was use theme that uses the provider.
Use theme. Yeah.
So you pass usually you'd wrap your app in the provider at the top, pass theme in there, so it's global to the application, and then use theme will pull it out of context.
That's cool. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So you said that you don't use post CSS because you got plugins for Webpack post CSS, but there are some post CSS plugins that would do accessibility use for wider web browser use, like IE.
Yeah, you can do. Well, if you can think of it, there's a plus CSS plugin for it, so you can do a lot of stuff, and it does give you a lot of benefits. Yeah, these libraries are just libraries for getting the CSS in there, so there's none of the extra accessibility features, unless you're using like a style linter or something. So yeah, I guess that is a downside. The tools are relatively new compared to, well, PostCSS. PostCSS has been around for years. Yeah, you'd have to probably do a bunch of that stuff yourself.
Is there any scenario? Oh, sorry, someone else has a question. No, I was going to say, is there any scenario where you wouldn't use JSS, or pretty much every context would you just go with it?
Plenty of scenarios where you wouldn't use it. I wouldn't bother using it on a small website. Anything small is probably not worth it. Probably don't even want to use React on a small site. Probably don't want to use anything. As soon as you get into a medium to large scale business, that's when you can start feeling the pain points of scaling your CSS. No amount of BEM conventioning will really stop these issues happening. Someone's going to clobber your styling at some point and you're going to hate them for it. But it happens. I mean, you can fix it. It can be fixed. But using this stuff prevents it from the start.
Build on that, do you think people just, like, part of the problem with maintainability is that people don't care about CSS?
I think a good part of the problem is people don't know how to do CSS properly. It is quite difficult because it's different. It's a lot different to just programming, like JavaScript and stuff. You do end up adding conventions in for big things like BEM and other stuff, which can be maintainable. It can be. This just, in my opinion, is a lot easier. Plus it's restrictive as well, which sometimes you'll want in a style system. If you've got a bunch of designers and they've come up with a design system for you and they spend months working on it, and then you're like, nah, product owner don't like it, we're gonna overwrite styles ourselves. Yeah, it can help with that as well, especially if you're forced to use that library. But yeah, I think to answer the main question of do people care, I think some people do, but I think it's like anything really. It's like, it works. It's fine.
Can we have one more question?
Yeah, sorry.
Was there someone who had a question over here?
Yeah.
Is there much uptake, apart from kind of React-based projects where it's kind of forced, is there much uptake in other areas? Or?
So with JSS itself, it doesn't need a... there's framework agnostic. So that's got decent uptake. Some frameworks you wouldn't bother all the time. So if you're using Vue has the option for scoped styling, so you can just use that if you really want. That'll basically mangle the class names for you. Yeah, at that point you should be fine if you're just in the view world.